Welcome to the Peepshow Podcast.
News and stories from the sex industry.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peepshow Podcast. This week we focus on the porn industry. Mike Stabile of the Free Speech Coalition updates us on the new COVID guidelines and talent testing service pulling out of the pass system. Then we talk to performer and director Mickey Maud about racism in the porn industry.
This episode of the Peepshow Podcast is sponsored by Quick and Dirty Media.
Are you an independent content creator, webcam model, or clip maker? Quick and Dirty Media can help you with your video editing and production needs at a reasonable price, allowing you to devote more time to creating your content. As a special offer for Peepshow Podcast listeners, the first 5 content creators who submit a video for editing will receive their first order free. Make sure to use the promo code PeepshowPod. Find Quick and Dirty Media on Twitter at QuickDirtyMedia or send an email to info@quickanddirtymedia.com. Quick and Dirty Media is proud to be an adult-friendly business.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Peepshow Podcast.
Welcome.
So today's episode, we're going to be talking about mainly news from the porn industry.
Yeah, a lot of news from the porn industry. And there's been so much happening in the porn industry that we can hardly keep up, but we are trying for you guys.
So later in the episode, we are going to be talking about race and this town hall conversation on race in the industry. But first, we wanted to talk about some news regarding COVID-19 and testing.
Yeah, so we wrote an article where we interviewed the Free Speech Coalition and a bunch of other performers about the new guidelines that the Free Speech Coalition put out in regards to the lift on the porn production ban. So we've been talking about that, but in the meantime, other news has come up because the talent testing service has pulled out of pass testing. So we brought on Mike Stabile, who's the communication director at the Free Speech Coalition, to kind of catch you all up on what's going on with that. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So can you tell our audience a little bit about the guidelines that you just published?
Yeah, so I was on the COVID task force, which was a group that sort of put together guidelines for production for people who are going to return to production. We basically went through every aspect of production to find ways in which you could lower risk. The issue with COVID is obviously that it's a lot different than an STI.
Right.
There are many more points of entry. It's a lot. We don't know nearly as much about the virus and how the incubation period and transmission. So we put out a guideline that sort of said, listen, if you are going to return to shooting, we don't think that it's safe, but if you do need to return to shooting, this is how you would do it safely, or this is how you would do it with a lowered risk.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that you all were really clear about when we talked to you, but also in the guidelines, is that this isn't this is how you do it safely. It's much more of like a harm reduction model because we still don't know enough about COVID to believe that it's safe to go back.
Yeah. And I think that we look at ourselves as a different version of the mainstream film industry. This is not a sexually transmitted disease,
right,
or infection. This is something that you could catch from kissing or catch from, just a close contact scene. So that's going to be something that mainstream film actors are going to be exposed to as well. We followed the guidelines in California and elsewhere in terms of it's time to reopen these types of productions. Film production was one of them. We advised our members that it wasn't necessarily safe to open or was not safe to produce, but if you were going to follow the state's guidelines, here were ways that you could reduce your potential exposure.
One of the standards for safety on set is testing through the PASS system, right? But those are typically tests for all the STIs.
And we should say PASS stands for Performer
Availability Screening Services.
Great.
Thank you. I knew that 2 days ago, and then it slipped my mind.
Right. So the PASS system has been set up to do all of the performers' STI panels. And to that, you all, in the guidelines, added COVID testing. So can you talk about that?
So we added COVID testing to our database and included it in the guidelines because obviously performers want to know whether or not somebody's been tested or how recently. We did not change the PASS system itself,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that a pass test is about STIs. We
Right.
can, with a fair degree of confidence, say if you test, within this period and you're cleared to work for 2 weeks, your risk is going to be low for an STI.
Right.
Based on things like incubation and viral load and things like that, particularly HIV.
Yeah.
With COVID, we just don't have that ability. And so we didn't want to add COVID to the pass test because we couldn't offer the same degree of confidence that it would be safe to go back to work.
Yeah.
But what we did do, our labs are all adding COVID tests, and we've broken out a separate section that sort of says, this is when you had the last clear COVID test.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, we don't have a firm time period where it would be safe after a COVID test to work, because that person may go to the grocery store that night and get it. They may go home and their partner may have gotten it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So it's all about risk reduction.
Right.
It's all about trying to balance those things. So what we've done is we've created a column that says, this is the last time this performer had a clear COVID test. For some people, that's going to be, it has to be within 24 hours. Other people may be able to say, well, I think that 3 days is fine. But because we don't have a science around it, we're just giving the basic information and letting people make those choices themselves, or, the producers.
Yeah. Yeah. So what were some of the concerns that you noticed from, or questions that a lot of people had after the guidelines came out?
Well, as you know, because you've seen the guidelines, it's 30 plus pages of very detailed notes
Right.
as to what you need to do.
Yeah.
And so immediately what came out was people said, well, I can't possibly follow these. I can't do all this. I have a small production in a far-flung state, and how am I ever going to be able to do this?
Right.
And so the first thing that we really had to clarify was that these are not mandatory, that these are guidelines that were done with an industrial hygienist and a medical board to sort of say, here are ways you can lower your risk.
Mm-hmm.
We know that everybody's shoot is going to be different. We know that, for example, if you have a shoot where you have no local talent and you have to fly people in, that you're going to have to make some decisions. You're either going to have to say, I am willing to live with that risk as a producer, and my performers are willing to live with that risk. Or I'm going to say, I'm going to fly you in, you're going to wait 2 days in quarantine, and then we're going to test you again, and then you'll be able to shoot for a day.
Yeah.
You're going to have to sort of make those calculations themselves, just because we don't have anywhere near the clarity with COVID that we do, or anywhere near the security we do
Right.
with an STI.
Yeah.
And so that was the first thing, was that people were just saying, I can't do this. And so our initial thing was, you don't have to. These are tools, not rules.
Right.
And that was one of the things that we really felt we needed to answer a little bit more clearly in the FAQs today.
Right.
Yeah.
And it should be said, too, that some people are just opting not to shoot.
Absolutely.
Given their own risk assessment.
Yeah, there are plenty of people, producers and performers, who say, well, I'm not going to shoot until 2021, or I'm not going to shoot until there's a vaccine, or I'm not going back to professional porn shoots at all. I'm going to just shoot on my OnlyFans or my FanCentro or whatever platform I'm using, my ManyVids.
Right.
And that's how I'm going to do my sets. We do know, though, however, and you mentioned harm reduction, that, as with HIV prevention and so many other STIs, abstinence is not necessarily effective. So if I am a performer and, I think, based on my income, I really do need to return to work, or based on the fact that, I think that I'm reasonably healthy, I'm not really scared of COVID, or I live in a region where it's very low, I'm going to return to work. Those were all sort of things that we understood that people would be making decisions based on the specifics of their situation. We knew that people were going to return to work, and we wanted to say, if you do, here are ways to lower it.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I wanted to know what's going on with talent testing services, because it seems like they've pulled out of the pass system, and that seems like pretty big news. Can you explain what's going on there?
Sure. So talent testing was probably the largest network in the pass system. And we had discussions with them early on to be involved in the COVID task force. They declined. We did have conversations. They were one of the first to add a COVID test.
Okay.
Prior to everyone returning to work. When we talked about integrating COVID into pass, we were really clear that we thought that they needed to be separate, that we couldn't have someone come in and test for COVID and be cleared for 2 weeks.
Right.
That was, you were giving a false sense of security for something that we couldn't even guarantee for 24 hours.
Right.
And we thought that, what we need to do in this situation is give people information, and more is more. Ultimately, they decided earlier this month to stop sending results to PASS. They said, we disagree with the way that it's being done.
And sorry to interrupt, but when you say results, Are you talking all results, not just COVID results, but results for STI
all
testing?
Results. So they said, we will not send STI tests into PASS so long as you're doing it this way. We've asked a lot of different times as to why this was the case. We got a lot of different answers. There has been a contentious relationship between TTS and PASS in the past. And this is not entirely new. I think that, as one of the larger networks, I think that they want to make choices as to how things should be done. PASS is a nonprofit. We don't make any money off of PASS. In fact, it probably costs us more money to operate it. Just in terms of man hours and things like that.
Right.
We don't, and so our only goal is to preserve the health and safety of performers.
Right.
We don't worry about market share. We don't worry about whether or not it's making a profit. All we do is try to make it as clear as possible. I can't speak to anyone else's motives. I do think that we did want to make sure that these things were broken out separately. I think that ultimately the breaking point was we thought that COVID testing should be something that you can get anywhere.
Yeah.
That you can get that for free in Los Angeles, because it's expensive. I think that an FDA-approved test is something like $100. There was a discount that TTS was offering, but we said, with all of these people, especially crew members who are now going to be tested,
Right.
all of this added expense on an already expensive testing protocol, that should be, if you have insurance and you can test through that, you should be able to do that.
Sure.
If you can go to Dodger Stadium in LA and get that test, you should be able to do that. You shouldn't be required to do it at a PASS certified lab, because those labs are often inconvenient to get to. People are going every 2 weeks. It may be more expensive there. We wanted to give people options. And we also had crew members who said to us, we don't want to be in a public database. I work on mainstream production. I don't want my name there. So there were all these sort of different reasons. And we said, it has to be separate. We have to keep it separate, both for convenience, both for medical accuracy, and, to keep the price down. And that proved to be a breaking point. So they stopped sending their tests in, and we are in discussions with another national network now to replace, to fill that void.
I mean, that's a pretty big problem for people like us in Pittsburgh. So, for example, before we went to AVN and I knew I was going to be shooting with other people, I went to a TTS center in Pittsburgh, so that could be all ready to go by the time that we got to Vegas. And most of the people who are working, not in LA or Vegas did the exact same thing, So so I think that creates a lot of complications for people who aren't in one of the epicenters.
Yeah, but what's so complicated about that, and I think is worth pointing out, is that but you then got onto an airplane, and so were you to get a COVID test, wouldn't we just assume that was irrelevant anyways after you went through an airport and were exposed to thousands of people, right? So I mean, it throws the whole thing up in the air. It makes sense, right? Because you can get tested and then not have sex with somebody in the airport, but
I could
you
probably
can't
manage
get
that.
tested and then not breathe the same air as somebody in the airport, right? That's what's so profoundly different about the COVID situation, which I think is why it's kind of odd to think that we should collapse those into the same thing. I mean, I'm giving my kind of editorial opinion here, but that's that's my concern.
And that was ours as well. I think that this was that we knew that these were very different beasts and they needed to be treated differently. So that was really it. It was trying to figure out, giving people as much flexibility and as much knowledge as they can have, and then leaving them to make their best judgments.
Where are things going with PASS? Do you think that we're just like it's going to move to another company that's not TTS?
Yeah, so there's CET and AIT are two labs. They're mainly based in Los Angeles and Vegas, although there are other testing locations. They don't necessarily have the same turnaround time. But
Yeah.
we are in conversations with another national lab network that will have locations in more far-flung places. If we can have what we're looking to do really is to fill that hole. TTS is not the only testing center, testing network in the country.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are plenty of labs, and we are just sort of trying to figure out exactly how it would work. We had one previously in the fall that we had added that actually had over 1,000 locations. We're looking to do that again. And it's just about getting them online. And unfortunately, it happens at a really difficult time because people are just returning to work. There's already a ton of uncertainty in when it comes to COVID testing. But hopefully, we'll have that online within relatively shortly, and this will all be behind us.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Do you have any takeaways or something that you think that people should be thinking about in terms of COVID and returning to work right now?
Yeah, I would say that use your gut. I think that both in terms of, we talk a lot about in terms of what am I comfortable with on set? Am I comfortable with a set where everyone was tested 3 days ago? Do I have other health issues that I might want to consider? Am I living with somebody with a health issue that I might want to be a little bit more cautious?
Right.
Those are things that we always talk about, but I think that you also have to really use your intuition and gut in terms of, what do I know about this production company? Are they people who are really, dotting the I's and crossing the T's on everything that they do? Or does this feel really slipshod? Does this feel like a fly-by-night production? In those cases, it's you're not going to know how well they're going to clean a set. You're not going to know how well, you're never going to be able to guarantee, whether or not they stayed home or they went to a bar the night before.
Right.
So a lot of it is, what's the sense of this company? Do they seem like they are doing things by the book, or does it feel like they're just sort of phoning it in? I think those are the sort of choices you have to make as you go back, is to think, what is my own risk tolerance? And then if my risk tolerance allows me to return to work, how do I judge the people that I'm working with? Both in terms of other performers and production companies. How stringent do I think they are?
Yeah, I think that's really important.
One thing that's been happening in the industry is really this vast transformation towards independent production and content, towards camming, towards clip production. Anyone who goes to conventions has really, seen the evidence of that on the convention floors. And what I've seen in the past couple of years anyways, is that increasingly independent performers are working more together. There's more cross promotion. There's more sort of planning out and doing scenes with other self-producing performers. And second, increasingly, I found that cameras and clip producers have embraced pass and expect pass testing. But that also means that the demands on the pass system are different, right? People are shooting in much more geographically dispersed locations, for example. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you if you have any thoughts about how pass is adapting to that new reality, especially given that COVID has seemingly kind of catalyzed that trend further.
We're thrilled that people who are doing content trades or who are working on premiums are using pass. It is a vote of confidence in the pass system. And the reason the pass system has been so successful is because there's been such buy-in by the performers themselves. So I think that what we want to avoid happening is having a patchwork of different testing systems, as much as possible. Soon we will have another lab online, and I think that the disruption that we're talking about now will sort of be in the rear view and we'll be able to move on. But I think that there is such value in the pass system. The pass is the only one that really can call a production hold. Pass is made up of various labs. So if the person you did a content trade with were to test positive and they tested a different lab than you did, we can coordinate that.
Right.
We have the relationships with it. So there is such value in pass that doesn't come from, you were tested according to these protocols and that's fine. It comes from, the overall organization where you can say, no, we're calling a production hold. We've tested all of the first generation contacts, no matter where they tested. We paid for them to come in. We know what their scene partners look like for the past 30 to 60 days. We've retested those people as necessary. It's not something that's ad hoc, these production holds. Like, we have a protocol. We know how to do it. We've been through it so many times, successfully, in terms of preventing onset transmission, that, there is an incredible value in it. If you are able to get to a pass network, it offers, just such an additional degree of information and protection than just the test itself.
Yeah.
So, where people are able to get to a pass system, even if it's a little bit more inconvenient, we ask that you do it in the time being. If you can't, we understand, but want you to know that there is going to be an added level of risk. You won't have the same assurances in terms of how a hold is going to be called and how it's going to be lifted and how the tracing is going to be conducted.
Right. That's really helpful. Where can people find more information about what's going on right now with COVID testing and the return to work guidelines?
So you can go to freespeechcoalition.com and look at our both press releases and policy statements. They detail these things. I think the easiest way is to go to Twitter and look at FSC Army. That is really where everything is published. You'll get everything from, the policy documents in terms of the guidelines to, what we're doing in regards to filling the gap left by TTS to, the FAQs you talked about in terms of how do I do this with my own production.
Yeah, and later this week you are also having some, I actually forgot what they're called.
A question and answer session?
We're having some question and answer sessions with Michelle LeBlanc.
Okay.
So that people can sort of dive in a little bit more specifically as to, here's my situation, what do the guidelines tell me? Again, we can't give specific recommendations, but we can help you interpret the guidelines and sort of say, this is what they were meant to say. Here's how to understand. Here's how to start to apply them to your own production.
Yeah, great. Okay. Thanks so much. And there's information there on your Twitter page as well about those question and answer sessions.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you, guys.
Here at the Peepshow Podcast, we talk a lot about supporting sex workers. And one way you can support sex workers is by paying for your porn.
In the spirit of Pride Month, why not take this opportunity to support a trans-owned and operated queer porn collective? Trouble Films offers a wealth of different kinds of porn and erotica. We love it, and we know you will too. Go visit them and check out their films on troublefilms.com or on sites like pinklabel.tv or Hot Movies. We're here today with Mickey Mott, who's been a porn performer for 13 years, worked behind the camera as a director, producer, and web developer, and served a term as vice president for APAC, the Adult Performer Advocacy Committee, and is currently the creative director at kink.com. Thanks for joining us today, Mickey.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I guess we should start by noting, too, that recently XBiz held a town hall on race, which you were also a key part of.
Yeah. So there's 3 moderators for that panel and 9 performers, so 12 of us all together. It's kind of a town hall style panel to talk about, as we are in the midst of this unfortunate situation in our country. I guess we've always been in the midst of this situation in our country, but in terms of people speaking up and protesting and looking at everything in America, and porn is included in that.
Yeah.
We're a visual media. We put out images, and those images have impact, and we need to kind of talk about what those images mean and how people, Black people and other people of color, can participate in putting out healthier images.
Yeah. What brought about the town hall?
So I was contacted by one of the editors of XBiz, and they told me that they were kind of putting on this panel, and they were looking for people that could moderate it, but also kind of keep the conversation, as they put it, real. And this, unfortunately, I feel with just the way that we kind of run news cycles in America, we're not going through the first Black Lives Matter protest. We're not going through the we're not going through the third, unfortunately.
Right.
And this currently is the biggest, and we've seen it in all 50 states and multiple countries. And I feel often when these things come up, there is, and I often see this catchphrase started by a lot of corporations. They're like, let's start the conversation. Let's start the conversation.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I said to XBiz is like, we can't talk about starting the conversation when only one party has been talking and the other party hasn't been listening.
Right.
Right.
And then that's, I think, a frustration that a lot of Black people and a lot of people of color in this country feel. And I think in the adult industry, in the last couple of weeks, you've seen a lot of disturbing things kind of come to light around sexual assault.
Right.
And like unfair treatment and around performers not being protected. And I think there's a same set of problematic behaviors that happen in the adult industry and just in our society in general of like something really bad happens to somebody has a horrible experience, and that experience is up to the victim of that experience to prove that it happened.
Right.
And to prove that their experience is valid and needs justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just to step back for a second, I mean, as you mentioned, what part of what was being discussed is like porn's complicity in racism in this country, because as a medium, it puts images out there in the world, and those images, like so many other images, can impact the way that people think about and talk about race. More importantly, the way that people interact with and treat people of color. But also, another thing that was talked about a great deal in the panel is just how Black people in particular are treated in the industry. Different things like access to roles and the kinds of roles that Black people are expected to play in the industry. So I wonder if you wanted to pick up on that conversation too a bit.
Yeah, I think some of the responses that I'm seeing, on social media to, performers bringing up these issues is, well, then why do you perform, or why are you in this industry? And, commonly with sex work, when something, negative happens, there's an attack on sex work itself of like, well, you put yourself in this position.
Right.
And that is, a rhetoric that kind of gets thrown back at Black and brown performers about like, well, then why do you take those roles? And not realizing that there's so few roles available.
Yeah.
And there are so few people of color making decisions around content and how content is going to be marketed. And the culture of adult entertainment in our society is largely driven toward a cis hetero white male audience.
Right.
Yeah.
When that is the mindset of like who is consuming a product, there's not a whole lot of account taken into why and how these images are being structured and being made, and the effect that has not only on the consumer, but also on that group of people that's being represented and how they internalize. I think oftentimes, especially in this country, we look to entertainment as like, oh, this is a view of the world that I may not have access to.
Right.
And I think for some people who don't have that experience of being or living around people of color, a lot of that, I mean, we see that a lot of that is informed by entertainment.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that you're saying, or I was thinking about as you were talking, is the fact that some of the discussion was around access to roles and how films are marketed. So that's obviously in relationship to a lot of the production studios. But what about independent creators? Do you think that there's more openness there, or do you think that replicates some of that the indie market replicates some of the same inequities that you see in the mainstream market?
Well, I do think there's definitely a lot more openness in the indie market. For a long time, like the means of distribution was controlled by studios.
Right.
And so, studios had the equipment, they had the websites, they had, the bandwidth, they had the power to kind of dictate what that content looked like. And now kind of have a more, their platforms like MiniVids and OnlyVans and a number of other sites that kind of give this sort of direct to consumer, like from performer directly to consumer.
Right.
But I still feel that there are still some things, like when we talk about like tagging and how things are indexed and kind of searchability, and like these terms that have conditioned an audience to type in certain things to find the thing that they're looking for.
Yeah.
And I think a part of the things that performers are asking for that they want to see changed, I think is just a little bit more transparency and a little bit more effort put into, educating the audience that not everybody, self-identifies with these terms. And a lot of these terms are hurtful. But we've been using them for a long time, but those terms haven't been updated.
Yeah, they're it seems like the adult industry really is slow to update its marketing and search terms, like relative to the rest of society. I mean, I know that has been a big issue of discussion among trans-identified performers. For a long time, the search terms that were used for trans performers were slurs. And only very recently have sites started to change that now to use search terms that people that are the words that people actually identify with, like just trans, for example. And so I wonder if, if there's any specifics in terms of those kinds of search terms and categories that, people of color are looking to have a conversation about changing.
I think specifically on that panel and on a number of conversations that I've had and other panels that I've been on around the subject, the term ebony and the term BBC, the term ghetto being used. I think this is kind of like a real problem with tube sites that allow user content uploads, that those aren't like stop words aren't put in so that you can't title something with like the word rape or torture. Not every site takes the effort to do that so that people aren't uploading offensive material.
Right.
And I do think that there is, along with the fetishization of Black and brown bodies, there is an impact of like an internalizing impact of, I have, younger people in my family who are, just coming into their sexuality, who are internalizing that like, oh, every person wants a BBC and it's all about having no one markets anything with a medium or a small black cock,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which I imagine must be very hard for a lot of Black men in the country if they don't like fit those stereotypes.
Yeah. And I mean, porn is shot on extremes. And I think this is also kind of like a problem with our expectation for the quantity of content that adult entertainment produces.
Mm-hmm. Say more about that.
We produce content on the level of like, most like news channels, like, like daily, in some cases for some companies, it's like daily updates, multiple times a week, depending on like, the size of the company. And there's a focus on like new. And, in that level of production and that schedule requires oftentimes a lack of time in that pre-production, a lack of time in that communicating with performers about narrative and about marketing and about, oftentimes, many times it's been in the 13 years that I've been performing, it has been very rare that I know what a scene or a movie that I'm in is going to be titled.
Yeah.
And I think that creates like a particular problem for Black and brown performers when you have to, then are asked to promote something that, hey, you don't believe in the way that like these things were titled. And then that gets used to, for example, AVN's Clever Title of the Year award for 2018 was Black Loads Matter.
Oh my God.
Oh, wow.
So, and it's something that we've kind of called out, AVN and XBiz on like, okay, you're enabling shitty behavior and you're rewarding this. You're literally giving this company an reward for creating this product, not informing the people involved, the performers involved, that it was going to be titled this, so they could choose to say like, hey, actually, I don't want to be in this movie that maybe mocks it, that is really close to me and is really important to me.
Yeah.
But then that performer has to be on social media, and then it takes away their ability to effectively speak on the subject when that gets thrown back in their face. And I don't think a lot of consumers of porn understand a lot of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes that make it a really difficult place for performers to advocate for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, because it seems like not only do you not support, naming a movie in that way, but actually it looks as though you're actually endorsing these titles or these representations. So when you have a title like Black Lives Matter, it looks like you're endorsing a sort of trivialization of the Black Lives Matter movement when really you had no involvement.
No say in that. Yeah.
No say in that whatsoever. And maybe would have, totally walked from the project if you knew that it was going to represent you in that way or represent Black Lives Matter in that way.
Yeah. Or I've particularly had situations where I've gotten to set and found out, here is the narrative of the day where you are going to be playing a drug dealer, and you're kind of put in this situation of like, well, now I know a lot of other performers have been in the same situation where you kind of faced with a choice of like, all right, well, I can walk out and cause myself work, cause the sound person work or the camera person work or the makeup artist work for that day, and maybe get a reputation for being a team player or being difficult or being a diva or whatever it is that you're afraid of in terms of like the professional consequences, to have to put that in the same situation of like your own ethics and how like you are represented as a person and how other people that may identify with you are then taking in those images, or other people who don't have experience with people who look like you are taking in those images.
Yeah. I think one of the things that is interesting about what you're saying is that it very much does echo the sort of conversations that like women in the industry are having right now about sexual assault on set, where people are saying, well, why would you be there? Or why do you participate in that? Or why didn't you say something when, something was going on that you were uncomfortable with? Is that doesn't take into consideration like the structure of the industry and of those studios and the pressure to not do something that's going to deem you as like a problem or get you blacklisted or even just create conflicts of interest between you and, like you're saying, the makeup artist and the other people who are there to try to work. Yeah.
There's no real safety net for performers. There's nobody outside of our industry advocating for us.
Yeah.
There's no politician that is like, these are workers and we need to protect them. If the conversation around sex work does get brought up by politicians, it tends to be more on, more on the illegal sex work side and a worry about sex trafficking, which is definitely a very popular topic for politicians to pretend like they care about.
Right. Yeah. That's the right way to say it, I think, to pretend like they care, because they're not actually doing anything to help trafficking victims. But an interesting point that brings up is that there is like an issue too, given that there isn't any safety net and given that people are outside of the industry are very quick to blame the industry for things. It does kind of perpetuate this problem because people don't want to talk about what's wrong with the industry and have that weaponized against them.
People who work in the adult industry are put in this very difficult position where you're in a heavily stigmatized industry. But the things that for a lot of people the industry provides is maybe work at a higher pay level than you would be able to get otherwise, or a sort of professional experience that you would be able to have in terms of like on the production side. I know a lot of people who, were either like film school dropouts or, tried to work in mainstream, but they, didn't have the background or didn't feel that they could go through, the process of like, maybe in 10 years I'll be able to like touch a camera.
Right.
Whatever reason, they saw a benefit in working in this industry. And you take that risk where that this is not something that is commonly accepted or not something that is seen as a long-term career option, or just a phase or part of like your own sort of like personal rebellion.
Yeah.
And I think you kind of fail to realize sometimes that for some people who maybe they were working some like shitty like restaurant job, and then like 3 years later they're able to put a down payment on a house, or whatever sort of financial goal that they have, that come up, so to speak, is I think really something that people are very protective of like, I, was able to I made this risk
Yeah.
of this social, and I have to stand by my choice.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there are these things that I want to fix.
Yeah.
And it becomes really hard. I mean, you see this with sports all the time, especially in the case of like Colin Kaepernick, the shut up and play football sort of mentality to like speak about like.
Yeah. And I also think as you were talking, I was thinking another thing too, which is that people who do take the risk to enter into the sex industry also have to stand by their choice, because it's really difficult to transition out of it, particularly if you have, if your face is very recognized with the porn industry or with the sex industry, that forecloses some other possibilities. And so there is like not only do you have more opportunities, or at least this is, a way that I've thought about, not only do you have more opportunities that may give you some sort of financial security, but also there's a reason to, defend those choices, because those foreclose other choices, I guess.
Yeah.
Which isn't the fault of the industry. It's like the fault of the stigma around
it's just the stigma around the industry, which is a much bigger social issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's so often that like performers and people in the industry are told to get a real job, and then you try to get a real job, and then you're told you can't have said real job because you were in the industry.
Right. And that's something that's like really difficult to get out of. Yeah, I was wondering, like, circling back to the panel itself, what do you feel like some of the main like common themes that came out of that conversation were?
I think some of the common themes were transparency, the lack of transparency, which is, a benefit to all performers, of like, making sure that people know, and that kind of goes both ways, like making sure that production companies like know how, that there's this open communication about how people want to be presented and how people want to be identified, and that companies are open to hearing that. I think oftentimes, because there is such a transitional workforce in adult entertainment, there's this sort of thing of like, oh, well, this person is not going to be here in 3 months, so it doesn't matter. And that's really not the case. I mean, I think we're seeing like more than ever, people are out about being sex workers and out about that they're being able to thrive and make their living and their livelihood on this. And they be involved in those conversations about how another company is going to present them. And that needs to be, a back and forth, and then, inclusion and diversity issues. When you have Black screenwriters and Black directors and Black copywriters on, Avian and XBiz side, you are probably not going to have a lot of those same issues, because they're not going to be making the same types of choices about how people are represented or how things are written or marketed. Like a Black makeup artist on set is going to go a long way for how people feel that their image is, or how their hair is taken care of. And, having a Black, camera person on set, or a person of colors who is, on that sort of behind the camera, who's going to know that like, hey, I'm going to expose for certain skin tones a certain way, because you really do have to take that into account for people to look their best.
Right.
And I know myself and a lot of other performers are tired of being an afterthought or a compliment to a white performer.
Yeah.
Another thing is like eliminating wage disparity solely based on weight. And that's something that I think all too often in the industry, there's been this ongoing conversation on how certain companies will pay more for a performer's first interracial, and it is almost always, oftentimes, they will pay more a white performer for that interracial scene with a Black person. That Black person doesn't get paid more. That Black person doesn't get offered their first interracial scene. The sort of valuation of fragility, sexuality of a white woman being on a pedestal, is largely problematic. And I think there's another problematic argument that always gets thrown back about like porn being this thing about having to compensate people for their first sort of thing as a marketing thing.
But if that's not applied across the board, that's just a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what other industry can you do that in?
Yeah.
Or to say that like, hey, you know what? I'm not going to work with Black people for the first 5 years of my career. Is that okay with you if I just decide I'm not going to, like, you can't do that at the post office.
Right.
You know? And that being accepted as, and oftentimes rationalized as, and this is, I think, something that is just really irritating to me, that it is often rationalized as a feminist issue around bodily autonomy.
Yeah.
There's an argument of like, well, this is my body and this is my choice. And like, yes, it is your body and it is your choice. And I don't want anybody ever to take that away from you. But you have to have some accountability on your body and your choice being a racist choice.
Right.
Being a choice that is deeply rooted in anti-Blackness.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there has to be some accountability in that. And it can't just be like, you can't just say like, well, I'm a feminist and this is my choice. But there has to be an accountability. And I think that is a conversation that we're not having.
Now is a good time to hit the pause button and head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/Peepshow Podcast. Even $1 a month shows us that you care and want to see Peep Show continue to thrive. Also, you can help increase our reach with a review on iTunes. Yeah, I mean, I think that it often gets framed like that outside of porn too, as like, well, people have their preferences, as if preferences aren't something that are socially constructed or that you should interrogate in some way.
Yeah.
I'm curious so one of the things that you said at the beginning of the interview is that when these sorts of panels or when companies take on these conversations, often they say like, we want to start this conversation. But do you feel like this conversation that took place on this XBiz panel was something that will actually lead to change? Or do you feel like there was just kind of lip service to the issue? Or what do you feel like the direction is right now in porn?
I mean, we're seeing, I think, more than ever, companies and publications like XBiz and AVN, making small incremental changes. And I by no means felt like this was going to be like, all right, we had this panel, racism is done, y'all. Like,
right.
It was really hard to get on board with it. And I still have kind of these weird feelings about it because as I'm sure you've seen, there's like, every corporation in the world right now is making a statement about supporting Black Lives Matter. But,
right.
So many of them feel really hollow. So many of them feel like, yes, you want to be a part of this news cycle, but what is going to happen like when things stop trending?
Yeah.
Like, are you going to do it every day? And I don't like, social media is not real life. And we see a lot of, people and a lot of people in our industry, like, retweeting slogans. And like, I want people to kind of really put their money where their mouth is. And really, I don't care what you say on social media. I care about like what you say to me and my, coworkers, like on set.
Yeah.
And that I think is going to be, the real test. And I there was also another panel with AVN, which is another adult industry publication. And that wasn't to the public. And it was just, I think it was about another like 12 or 15 performers talking, privately with some of the heads of AVN. And that was also a really frustrating meeting. And AVN just kind of released a statement a few days ago talking about how they had met with us and they were going to, put a Black host for the awards and like have, somebody to kind of consult with like on stage talent about diversity. And it was really insulting to a lot of people who were on that call because that was a kind of a random idea that was like kind of like tossed out about a symptom of a larger problem.
Right.
It's like real systemic issues that like needed to be addressed and that AVN needed to be held like accountable for enabling.
Yeah.
And we brought it up about having a Black host as something that was like, here's like the bare minimum of that you could do to just let us know that you're, committed to making a change, and they couldn't commit to that at all.
Wow.
They couldn't commit to, and this was the owner of AVN, couldn't commit to saying like, we could totally have a Black host this year. Like, that's not a problem. And kept wavering on it and was saying that wasn't something they could commit to, but was able to publish a couple of days later that was something they committed to. And
without consulting anybody or talking to them about it before they put out that press release.
Yeah. I mean, if you and I have a problem and then we don't reconcile it privately and then publicly, somebody is like, well, we're good now. We talked about it.
Yeah. Right.
And I think it also kind of denies some of the deeper work that we were asking to be done.
Right.
Yeah.
It also kind of reinforces that sort of top-down mentality.
Yeah.
That you can come to the table, but ultimately they're still the ones making all of the decisions. Or at least that's how I would read it, I think.
Just kind of in kind of adult industry, social media sphere, there is this sort of feeling of a need to separate the issues that are coming up on sexual assault on set and race and discrimination on set as separate issues.
Yeah.
And is an intersectionality around, and this is what I see as an intersectionality around, there are deep systematic issues that need to be changed. There are deep like porn issues that need to be changed that enable these things to happen. And if you stop the culture of people denying people's experience,
right,
if not providing space for people to be educated on like what their rights and resources are available to them, so that if something does happen, they know that they can go and get that taken care of. That there is like a network that we as performers can talk about people who are like known and habitual abusers, that we can discuss that without fear of losing our livelihood.
Right.
Like those behaviors and that culture like enable both of these shitty things to happen. And I've seen some like infighting lately about like people worrying about like changing the conversation, which is really kind of a hard place to like, we can't really put these things up against each other. There's things that kind of exist that are part of like problematic behaviors that can be changed.
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying instead of viewing the issues with sexual assault in the industry and the issues, the racial issues in the industry as competing against each other for attention. Instead, we should view them as results of the same systemic failures within the industry. I mean, the most obvious being that, like, the decision, circling back to what you said earlier, the decisions in the industry are overwhelmingly being made by white cis men for an imagined white cis audience. Even if the audience is actually more diverse than that, the way those power structures are set up probably affect both of those problems, in similar ways.
Yeah. I mean, there, I think is a space for change, in my heart of hearts, I hope that like kind of the way that people can change and that corporations can take like new directions and change their business models. Agencies and other people and performers themselves can like really kind of come together and make these changes. But I also see that there's a space where like maybe we don't need this traditional model anymore.
Yeah.
Independent content creators. Anna Fox was on that XBIZ call and was talking about how so often she's told by companies and producers that like Black women don't sell, Black women don't sell, Black women don't sell, and kind of brought up this thing of like, of course we don't sell because you've never sold us.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm OnlyFans and I'm seeing that like I sell there, people are coming to buy my content and to see me and identify with me and celebrate me the way that I want to be celebrated. Why can't you do that?
Yeah, I mean, that was my next question to you is like one of the things that I think that's happening simultaneously that's interesting is that with COVID, everyone got, the studios all shut down. So a lot of performers had to, if they weren't already, market their own stuff and go on all of the sites like OnlyFans and ManyVids. And it's kind of trending right now to say, well, let's just boycott XBIZ and AVN, and the same with the porn studios. Do you think that, like, what are your feelings about that?
I think it's great that we're in this space where all you need to really create content is really just like a phone with an internet connection, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
and they're seeing the sort of this shift to like people, like I think it used to be thought of that like people wouldn't accept this sort of like content because of the quality, and I think people are really kind of responding to that because it succeeds at a space where traditional adult entertainment has failed, and that's intimacy.
Yeah.
There's something more intimate about like, oh, like getting something from somebody's phone, like
Yeah.
it feels like, oh, you're sending me a dirty text message sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's something about that, as someone who, I work on the production side at a company, and like, it's something that we kind of talk about of, all right, like in moving forward, porn has traditionally worked on these sort of like really tired narratives and tropes, and there's a laziness about changing those sort of things of like, people are still doing pizza guy shit, people are still doing,
Right.
there's this thing that happens of like, oh, like there's an uptick on like this scene we did about like a stepbrother and stepsister hooking up. And then that is mass produced for years as this trend until something else starts trending.
Yeah.
And it's just like burnt out and it's lazy. And that same thing happens to like performers of color who, get to set and they're like, hey, we're doing this Cinco de Mayo theme. I bought this poncho and this sombrero for you to wear. And you're like, fuck you. I don't want to do that.
Right.
Because they think that they need to have a Cinco de Mayo thing because it's going to trend.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to see people stop being lazy, and maybe that's a little too much to ask for Americans in general.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that's also connected to what you were saying earlier in terms of just the sheer amount of content that's expected to be pumped out.
Yeah.
Given that there's only like so many things that you can do, and that there's not a lot of time between scene to scene to scene to really like think about how to do something different that kind of perpetuates the problem.
Yeah, and I hope that this COVID time, as unfortunate as the situation is where people aren't able to produce content in the same way, I hope, and that's why one of the reasons that I think that you see a lot of stuff happening now, because there's not this sort of like, we're going to sweep this under the rug or ignore it because we're too busy producing content. There's actually a real opportunity for companies to look at how they've been doing business. And now is the time where you have that space to like maybe put a little bit more effort into your planning. Everybody is taking a look at changing their production process to like make it a safer environment to be concerned about like COVID. And I think we need to start thinking about the livelihood of people, less about living and dying and more about living and thriving.
Yeah.
It's really easy for people to be like, oh, well, I want to like make my set as safe as possible because I don't want people to get sick and die. But it takes a lot more effort for people to say like, I need to think about how I'm treating people on my sets to make sure that they're like proud of what they're doing and they want to support and they want to promote this content. And then therefore I make more money, and therefore like people feel less shameful about what they're watching and want to share it with people and talk about it with people and maybe not stigmatize it as much.
Yeah. What do you think would need to happen for that to take place? Like, what sort of changes do you think need to happen as somebody who works on the production side of things?
Some of the changes that we are looking at like implementing is like, how can we make a better process of communication with performers from through the whole production cycle, right? Like from the time that we, or that are, the production companies that we work with contact a performer and say like, hey, like as a company, kink has definitely fucked up, and that we're learning from that is something that is really important to us in trying to make the process as transparent as possible of like, we are gonna, do this shoot. And, not only are we going to do these sort of like BDSM activities, like, do you have somebody that you want to be partnered with? Or like, here are people that we use that we trust are vetted in this BDSM activity. who would you like to work with? I think that's a thing that kind of can go a long way in the industry, is making sure that performers are able to choose a lot more who they work with, to have the time to kind of like do a little bit of research and be like, actually, I don't really like this person's politics for what they've been posting on social media. I don't really want to work with that person. Or to be in a situation where you can just provide the most information about how things are going moving forward. At Kink, we're having these sort of conversations about, because we deal with fantasy, and oftentimes we deal with fantasy that is on the darker side of fantasy.
Right.
We do interviews like before and after, talking about the experience of like, oh, was that bondage position hard? But I think we can do a better job at talking about like narratives, especially in a BDSM context. We talk about power dynamics. And I think right now, in the place that we are in the world, we're talking about power dynamics. We're talking about abuse of power.
Right.
And we can be better at choosing narratives that maybe challenges some of the assumptions that we have about like what the appropriate use of power is and what it should be, that, support a world that we want to see change and how we want to see it changed, and
I
wonder speaking of power dynamics, I think, I wonder what has to be done though in order for performers to feel safe actually speaking up when they don't feel like a scene, went the way they wish it went, or if maybe, it takes a few days, for them to process an experience, I just wonder if, part of the issue is in terms of power dynamics is, thinking about what can be done so that performers feel safe, providing negative or perhaps just constructive feedback without fear of retribution, how we could structurally, enable those sorts of conversations to happen.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of work to be done kind of on the organizing side. Porn doesn't really have a union. Like there is all right, try not to eye roll so loud. There's APAC, which is the Adult Performer Action Guild, or to be honest, like I don't really feel, and I know a lot of people don't feel strongly that they accurately represent the needs of the community. And also there's a lack of actual organization that can actually have any teeth with any sort of like consequence. And I think that's something that really needs to like really be put in place. And I don't really know how you do that without some sort of like outside support or without some sort of like momentum. I think oftentimes there is, because of how often people in adult industry or in sex work in general are taken advantage of, there's definitely a mistrust of, oh, well, why is this person doing this? Or like, I didn't ask that person to speak for me. Why do they feel that they, should be, the leadership? Or like, I don't know if my voice is going to get heard, or why are we talking about this issue when I want to talk about that issue? And it's really hard to like do that without any money. The issue is that like, when talking about race, that, the genre of interracial porn is a really profitable genre for a lot of companies. And, it being profitable is why people can pay, higher rates to white models to do interracial content, or why people are told to hold off onto it to a certain point. And that money is not going in the hands of Black performers. The sort of like reparations end of that, I'd like to see some of that money kind of given back to like performer organizations so they can actually like do that job of providing a safety net for performers.
So what would you say that the role of APAC is?
So I was on the board of APAC during the kind of during Prop 60, which was a couple of years ago. And APAC was always kind of set up to be a resource organization. It wasn't set up to be a union.
Okay.
So when APAC was kind of put together, it was set to be like, all right, like here are these legislations that are going to affect the industry. We need to make sure that people know about it. Like we need to put together a performer bill of rights so that people know what they can expect on a set and what is not okay and what is not okay and what they should have access to. Porn 101 videos of here's how to do your taxes as an independent contractor.
Right.
Here are like links that you can bank with that are not going to shut down your account because you're a sex worker. Here are other professionals, lawyers, accountants that are sex work friendly.
Right.
Here, information about like if you want to get into camming, if you want to diversify your income, like, here are all these different sort of resources, and also kind of providing, that sort of database so that people can disseminate information. And, I've been apart from that organization for a while, and I know that their focus has kind of ebbed and flows based on like what is kind of going on in the industry right now.
Mm-hmm.
APAC has had a really difficult history because one of the people that was on that first board of APAC was James Dean.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, that was, prior to James Dean,
Yeah.
so like,
Right.
I mean, I guess we should say for listeners, a number of companies have moved away from working with James Dean in the light of several sexual assault allegations in recent years.
Mm-hmm.
really hard for people to get on board with an organization.
Yeah, who has problematic people in their founding.
Are there things we haven't covered yet that you think it's important for our listeners to hear or important to talk about?
I think what's important, just I think in general right now, is that making sure that the conversation is continuing to happen on platforms, that we can't just let it fade away in like a news cycle,
Mm-hmm.
and that the real work is done often offline and in person where no one is going to see it.
Yeah.
For adult entertainment, like an industry that's hit hard with like piracy, and everybody wants things for free, and that is really kind of hard for us to kind of deal with some of the issues that we have when we're put in a situation where we have to constantly put our bank accounts against our ethics.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, that there's, as the industry becomes more cash-strapped, there becomes more pressures to do what's profitable as opposed to what's right.
Yeah. If folks want to consume porn ethically and they want to support Black performers, where's the best place for them to do that? And how's the best way for them to do that?
I think if you are going through, your Twitter and you're searching for performers of color, I think, looking for people's OnlyFans or the platforms that are, going to directly give money to performers, like your own mini vids, the, Just for Fans, the Is My Girls, and like all of those sort of platforms. Like, I think you're going to see probably in a little bit, as people start kind of banding together to kind of do sort of kind of performer networks of like, hey, here are like a bunch of performers that like you may not know about, but like they're all, retweeting each other and they're all kind of supporting each other, and you see them in each other's, productions. Like trying to find independent production is, I think, a real challenge, and it's really easy to go to like Pornhub and just find a ton of stuff. But, I think people need to kind of do a little bit of a deeper work. And yeah, I mean, I wish there was like a one stop place to say like, it's kind of like where all the independent content creators are looking. But
right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good suggestion, though, to go directly to the performers, and the places that the performers are selling their own content is a way that gives power back to the performers.
Yeah.
And usually if there's a specific performer that you see, and usually you are able to search that person on social media and on these other subscription sites or independent content sites. So many performers have accounts, social media accounts and accounts on those sites, that if you look those people up, you can find more of their content and find their independently produced content. In addition to the studio content that's easier to find, or that's pirated and floating around, whatever.
Yeah, where can people find you and your work?
I'm on Twitter, and I think that's kind of the easiest place to find me. It's twitter.com/themickey.mod. And I have a Linktree link on there that will link you to all the other places that I am online, ads, mini vids, OnlyFans, Instagram, etc. Linktree/themickey.mod.
Okay.
And that's the easiest place to find me. I am not as active on social media as I would like to be, just for sheer scheduling, and I'm a parent, and so
Yeah.
a lot of interviews that I like to put into that. So that's the balance in my life. So that's where you can find me.
Great. Well, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peepshow Podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter @PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter @sapiotextual or @jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/PeepshowPodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.